Hello, everyone. Welcome to the panel discussion on EFPIA disclosure and consent management. We are live and online. We have registrants from several countries attending today's session. So let me say very early morning, good morning and good afternoon to you all. My name is Ned Mumtaz. I'm the Pharmaceutical Life Sciences Practice Leader for qordata. And in the past, I've worked for Otsuka Pharmaceuticals, Viat, and others for over 20 years. I'm currently actively supporting over a dozen pharmaceutical manufacturers with their transparency reporting and consent management needs in EU and USA. It is my pleasure to bring to you today's panel discussion with two very distinguished guests, Brian Sharkey and Elisabeth Kohoutec. Brian is an attorney by trade and a successful business executive at Porzio, supporting over 100 manufacturers. Elisabeth is also a skilled legal practitioner at King Spalding, where they support several hundred manufacturers. So without further ado, I would like to give my panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves. Elisabeth, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Nat. So, as you already said, I'm an attorney at King Spalding, located in Frankfurt, Germany. And as a member of the life science practice, I'm counseling clients from the life science sector on all aspects of regulatory law, as well as litigation and unfair competition issues. And my work includes supporting our clients in the process of disclosure of data. And as you are aware, the disclosure of data due to sunshine regulations includes personal data of healthcare professionals, which may only be disclosed under certain circumstances. So we help our clients to comply with those restrictions and to disclose such personal data in line with legal regulations. The other aspect that comes in with the topic disclosure of corporations with healthcare professionals is that disclosing those data gives an insight as to how pharmaceutical companies collaborate with healthcare professionals. So therefore, pharmaceutical companies must ensure that the collaboration itself is lawful and complies with all the restrictions that apply to collaborations with healthcare professionals. So what we do is helping our clients to understand those restrictions and to implement ways of collaborations with healthcare professionals that are fully compliant. So that's a short insight to my work.
Thank you, Elisabeth. And next, I would like to introduce Brian Sharkey. Brian.
Thank you, Ned, and good morning, everyone. I'm an attorney at a law firm in the United States, Porzio, Bromberg, and Newman. I'm a partner with the Life Sciences group there, and in addition, our law firm has a subsidiary called Porzio Life Sciences that focuses exclusively on helping our clients comply with a host of healthcare regulations, laws, things of that nature. Being based in the U.S., we started off doing a lot of open payments work under the Federal Sunshine Act here, and more recently with the adoption of the EFPIA Disclosure Code and implementing codes by the various EFPIA members, as well as some of the governing European laws, and starting to see it spread to other places around the world in terms of the transparency movement. We help clients there too in terms of helping them produce their disclosure reports either manually or in consultation with them or through our system, and in the process of doing so help them with their consent and all the related aspects to that. So it was quite interesting going through it the first time under the EFPIA Disclosure Code for the 2015 data in 2016, and I'm sure it'll be interesting again this year, and looking forward to the conversation with Ned and Elisabeth and the other folks who are participating today as attendees.
Thank you, Brian. So I'm very excited that in a short span of 60 minutes, you will have the opportunity to learn and gain from the experiences that Brian and Elisabeth offer through their practices that span multiple continents and several hundred manufacturers. I also realized that the webinar format, where your PC screen separates you from the panelists, sometimes discourages you from actively asking questions. So I encourage you and I offer you the opportunity to type in your question at any point in time during the discussion. You don't have to wait for the topic to end. I have two supporting moderators who will diligently monitor your incoming questions, and they will help direct them to the panelists through me. Also, I promised that the transcript of the answers would also be sent to all the attendees after the session. So in order to make this panel discussion more effective, it would be invaluable to hear from you during the discussion. Also, I want to commit that this is live, unscripted session. The only thing scripted are my questions that were sent to the panelists a couple of days ago to give them an opportunity to frame their thoughts. However, their responses will be live, and certainly the answers to your questions would be live. And also, I want to put in a plug for Zafar and his team who have helped bring this session to us. Zafar and his team have been invited to speak in New York City in a Who's Who conference on digital marketing next month. So Zafar, thank you so much. So without further ado, let me frame the topic for today's panel discussion. What I want to highlight is that the attendees will acquire insight into issues related to transparency and consent management in EU. The topics we will look to address are practical experiences with implementing a transparency solution, both from a legal and business standpoint, risks in managing transparency, again from a legal and business standpoint, and then also a discussion on the impact of transparency on stakeholders. And these stakeholders span from pharmaceutical manufacturers to physicians to patients. A couple of topics that we would look to cover along with these three primary ones would be upcoming changes in consent management regulation to the extent this time allows us to address that, and then also just an opinion or a discussion on expectation of consent rates in the next round of disclosures. So with that, I would like to move to the first question for the panelists. What I would like to do is ask them that, in their opinion, what worked well for the manufacturers in reporting spend transparency information in 2015 and in 2016, and where do they see opportunities for improvement? I would like to recommend that in responding to this question, if the panelists could consider the aspects of collecting spend information, receiving physician consent, engaging physicians, producing the transparency reports, and adopting policies and procedures internally within the pharmaceutical manufacturer organizations. So with that, I would like to ask this question of Brian first. Brian, if you could kindly share your view of these questions.
Sure, thanks, Ned. I think there's a couple different aspects to that. I think first, just to kind of tackle, what worked well for manufacturers in terms of from the internal piece. And this was a big change for companies doing this. They were maybe collecting some of this data, or perhaps all of this data, but they didn't have to produce reports. So it was important internally, I think, and the manufacturers that were successful with it started the process very early. And to the extent that they could, getting buy-in from key leadership and having a plan in terms of how this whole project would be managed. Would it be managed centrally? Would it be managed more locally? Would they delegate to the local affiliates to handle things? Would they control everything from their headquarters and then work locally in terms of engaging with the physicians, getting the consent, things like that? So there's a lot of change management that went into this, and I think that companies that were able to get buy-in from leadership, have a well-defined plan, and then educate. They needed to first, before they could even engage and educate their HCPs, I think it was important for them to educate their own folks so that they knew what they were doing and why they were doing it. And I know that both in terms of folks that we worked with and attending various conferences and engaging with people in the space, a common question that folks would get is, why are we doing this? So this is a voluntary code. There's no law requiring us to do this. What's the benefit for doing this? So I think kind of dealing with having good answers for that in terms of supporting transparency, demonstrating that the ethical and open collaboration with HCPs is nothing that should be shielded from transparency. It's all good and productive type work. So having those kind of messages to get buy-in up and down the organization, I think that was key. And I think that companies that were able to start early and get that going fared well with this. And I'm happy to go on and talk about engaging physicians and getting consent, but I didn't know, I mean, I could just keep going, or if you wanted to break it up and have Elisabeth comment on that first piece, or how would you like me to go, Ned?
So Brian, we'll tag team. So Elisabeth, if you could touch on the same question around collecting spend information for 15 and 16 in your view.
So what we noted is that collecting and receiving physician content that that the pharmaceutical companies that deal quite well with it from a legal point of view. So they were quite prepared and were aware that collecting this information and processing this information and disclosing this information has legal implications with view to privacy laws. So as you know, the data they are collecting are containing personal data of the healthcare professionals. And those data of other persons cannot be just published just like that. It is restricted. And there must be a legal basis for publishing and disclosing personal information, personal data. So the healthcare professionals have to consent to the disclosure. And what we learned, or what we noted when speaking and talking to our clients, is that they were well aware of those privacy restrictions, and that they took care to ensure that they have a good consent management system, and that they only disclose data that where the healthcare professionals consented to that disclosure. So that went well from our point of view.
And then maybe if I could just comment on that too, and the way that companies went about getting consent, it was interesting. I think it also varied, and kind of went back to what I was saying before, that different companies took different approaches. Some just relied on local affiliates to prepare the necessary legal provisions that are complied with the local data protection laws. Others seem to develop more of a template out of maybe the headquarters, and then would rely on local affiliates to adjust it as necessary to comply with local data protection law. So you had that aspect of it. And then you also saw a different range of ways that companies went about actually getting the consent, from putting it maybe in an annual contract for a consent, or putting a consent language in a standard consulting arrangement, or getting a standalone consent. So there was a range on doing that. And I think kind of circling back also to the first point in terms of engaging HCPs, I think that was also a big challenge for companies, especially this first year, because much as I noted, maybe some within the company were wondering, why are we doing this? Why are we reporting this information? I think HCPs also had to be educated as to what Elisabeth was saying. Why am I going to give my consent so that my name is published along with the corresponding transfers of value that were received by me? What's the benefit or the upside for me to do that? And I think that we saw, and I know we're going to get into this later, the range of consent rates that not all HCPs thought it was a great idea to have their information disclosed on the individual level. So I think that educating and engaging with HCPs was a key component for those companies that were able to successfully get a high level of consent from their HCPs to report individually. And again, we saw companies take a range of approaches on that in terms of one-on-one meetings, maybe some email communications, meetings with their KOLs to explain what this disclosure code was, why they were participating, and what the benefits to transparency were. And I think that some of that is the function of, we want to do this to be transparent and to be open, but also because I think a lot of HCPs understood that it was important this information get out there, and also by having a good, effective industry code through EFPIA, the hope was that there wouldn't be the adoption of more sunshine laws. Obviously, we have the French sunshine law, a couple other countries popping up, and in some of those countries, there's also an obligation on HCPs to report their information in Denmark or Portugal. So I think that industry's message to HCPs was not only is it a good and ethical thing to do to demonstrate to governments and the public that our relationships are entirely proper and productive and benefit society as a whole, but also let's work together and have a good, effective self-regulatory scheme so that we don't get more laws in that are burdensome and different and require different information to be disclosed at different times, and very well may result in HCPs having a reporting obligation. So I think that engaging physicians early, trying to get their buy-in, get them to understand what the purpose of this entire system was, the more effectively companies were able to do that, the higher their consent rates probably were. And of course, some companies took different positions, and GSK has, and it's on their website by their disclosure report, said that no consent equals no relationship. So we'll see if more companies maybe move along to that line, in addition to what we're seeing develop with the industry groups and how they're reacting to the first round of consent rates, which I know we'll talk about too.
Super. So Brian and Elisabeth, thank you. If I may just take a quick minute to summarize. What we heard from Brian and Elisabeth is that this first 2 years, the key focus for the manufacturers was on internal collection, which they were able to do effectively and successfully. Some of the key determinants in a successful program were engaging headquarters or making a call between collecting data at the headquarter level or local or affiliate level. It was important to manage the program, applying some change management techniques and getting buy-in from leadership. Elisabeth shared that she felt that the process worked well for manufacturers from the legal point of view, and manufacturers were well informed and aware of healthcare professionals' consent and privacy requirements, and they looked to meet it. There were ranges of approaches used to collect the consent, but in general, what I heard is that panelists feel that the voluntary disclosure of spend information is a good practice for the industry as a whole. So thank you, team. I'm going to move to the next question. So what I would like to do next is discuss your opinion on impact of the EFPIA Transparency Directive on a host of stakeholders, including manufacturers, their business practices, their relationship with physicians, industrial associations, and public at large. So I would look to cover each of these stakeholders' impact in turn. So first, let's start with the manufacturer's business practices. Has the spend reporting and consent collection process affected pharmaceutical manufacturers' business policies and practices, in your opinion? I know, Brian, you touched upon GSK and a policy that they have expressed, but I would like to hear your and Elisabeth's take on other manufacturers in the industry in general. So, Elisabeth, if you would like to go first to address this question.
Sure. So what I would like to point out on that moment is that the implications for the business practice for the manufacturers also have like an issue from the criminal laws. And what we felt is that the manufacturers weren't like really aware of that when starting their disclosure procedures, because as we all know, granting benefits to a healthcare professional in order to influence the healthcare professional in his prescription behavior is bribery. And this is a criminal offense punished by law. So and now we have all the data published, and everybody can just look up in the database and see how much, which healthcare professional received what kind of compensation. And just disclosing this information can create the impression of having such an improper influence, which would be bribery and punished by criminal law. So when from now on that companies are disclosing that information, they are doing business with healthcare professionals and then disclose it later, they must really ensure that there is no that it does not create the impression that there is an unlawful influence. And such an impression could maybe be created only by paying a certain healthcare professional a large amount of money, a very high compensation. And we learned at industry meetings that public prosecutors are very well aware of now the new disclosure of the data, and they look into this data. And when they see that maybe a certain healthcare professional got a really high amount of compensation and they are not surely sure why, they could start criminal proceedings. So now when companies want to disclose and to share the data under, they must really ensure that the collaboration with the healthcare professional is fully compliant with law. So they must ensure that they only pay a compensation for a proper service, and that it does not have that it does not look like a benefit granted for just a prescription or something. So the business practice has really to it now more than before. The companies must ensure in their business practice when they cooperate with healthcare professionals that they pay only a market value for a certain service, and that they document this well. So if maybe public prosecutors stand in the house at one point and want to ensure that there's no bribery, that they can pull out the documentation and say, yes, we engaged this and this healthcare professionals for this and this specific project, and the healthcare professional worked for us this amount of hours, and he got a rate per hour, and this is so high, and this is market standard value. So the business practice at the collaboration with healthcare professionals now, companies have even to be more aware and more careful with that they do it in a very proper and legal and well documented and very well arguable way.
Great. Thank you, Elisabeth. That was enlightening and comprehensive. Brian, I would like to hear your opinion.
Sure. I think Elisabeth raises a really good point. And just being here in the U.S., and we've had several years of open payments data, and I would go to conferences, and I know Ned and his colleagues, and Elizabeth, you go to these conferences, and you see the U.S. attorneys always speaking to the fact that, yes, we're aware of the data being out there, and we consider it a data point. You know, we'll look at it, and we may use it. And this past year, we saw for the first time open payments data being relied upon as part of a criminal case, the case involving Insys Therapeutics. There's been a number of prosecutions surrounding it, but one of the aspects of it was a couple former salespeople being indicted for kickback allegations, and part of the supporting evidentiary record was FBI agents went and reviewed the open payments data that's publicly available on the CMS website and relied on some of those in terms of payments that turned out to be sham educational programs and things like that. So I think what Elisabeth was saying that is happening in Europe with the EFPIA data now being out there, we've started to see that really kind of turn into some real action here in the U.S., and I imagine it will be similar there in Europe, which reinforces, to Elisabeth's point, the need for good, solid legal business practices, your fair market value, your selection of HCPs being based on appropriate criteria. And I think that also reinforces the idea of having good policies, practices, and procedures in place. Obviously, for EFPIA, you want to get good consent and a good process flowing to be able to report the information. At the same time, it gives perhaps an opportunity to re-examine and ensure that company policies address all those points that Elisabeth raised as well. And I think to the larger point, I don't know that the mere existence of the EFPIA disclosure code changed how companies interacted with HCPs. They're still going to work with the same groups and types of HCPs for the same types of activities in terms of sponsorship for events and R&D, which gets reported in the aggregate, and the consulting agreements. So by and large, I don't think that the relationship changed. Ned mentioned that I had pointed out before about GSK saying no consent and we won't work with you. I haven't seen a widespread movement towards that approach by other companies, but we may see that. Of course, companies might want to build in an exception for KOLs or some of your most important folks on that. And I think that you're also seeing this whole EFPIA disclosure code, Novartis's annual statement, had a couple paragraphs about the importance of the EFPIA disclosure code and how they went about complying with it. So I think we're starting to see it just kind of build more into the culture of organizations, and seeing this data and getting this data, you'll be able to see perhaps and get better transparency within the company into who you're working with, and are those HCPs consenting, and perhaps you want to try to encourage them to consent to get your consent rates up. And having all this data in this format gives an opportunity for some data analytics. And I know Ned, I saw, has given some great presentations on that topic. But being able to see internally what your company is doing, where your money is being spent, getting that all together has some inherent value that can go out to commercial in different places and not just necessarily reside in compliance or legal or whoever owns the EFPIA disclosure reporting. And then all this data is out there for other individuals too, other companies too, so there's a lot that can be looked at. So I think that overall the company's interactions with HCP change by and large, but I think that we'll see more kind of going forward as this becomes more ingrained, hopefully, in terms of the industry HCP relationship.
Great, Brian. Thank you so much. Some excellent points for manufacturers to take note from the topics that both Elisabeth and Brian addressed. Let me summarize in a couple of sentences. The key thing is that you want to ensure that your disclosure does not present in any manner an impression of unlawful influence on physicians. What the panelists recommended is that you need to pay close attention to fair market value, to identifying the right HCPs for the right type of program and role. Brian also pointed out that the case of Insys Therapeutics in the US exposed a program that might be classified as sham educational program that got them into a bit of legal trouble. And also, Elisabeth pointed out that it's important that you have comprehensive, complete documentation, as well as policies and procedures in place to support your spend program. So panelists, thank you so much for that rich, comprehensive view on it. In the interest of time, I'll go to the next topic. And the next topic is what both of you have briefly touched, which is physicians and physician organizations with respect to consent. What we have seen is that there is a pretty wide range of consent that was reported by EFPIA in 2015. For example, the range varied from nearly 95% in Latvia to around 65% in Italy and 20% in Spain. Do you have an opinion on the drivers for the range of variation in consent approval? So any one of you who wants to go first, I would like to hear your perspective on the varied rate of consent across EU. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I think that this brings up a whole host of issues. And I remember going to conferences when the disclosure code, which sometimes is referred to as the transfer value code, was introduced, and you would sometimes see an HCP be on a panel disputing whether or not it was necessary. And I remember one common joke was an HCP would say, this isn't a transfer of value code, it's a transfer of bad reputation code, whereby he would be suggesting that pharma was just trying to transfer what it was perceived to have a bad reputation, paying doctors to the doctors themselves. So I think that was kind of early on in the process, and over time we saw more HCP organizations as they became educated on it, as EFPIA and the local member associations did their due diligence in working with those stakeholders to buy in. And for the most part, across Europe, I don't think that we've seen any real HCP organizations come out and say that this is a bad thing to do. It's bad to be transparent and you should not consent. I think some, and part of it is there's so many different organizations and groups. I think most of the organizations that we've seen who have taken a public stand on it commended it and encouraged their members to go ahead and consent to disclosure. But that doesn't necessarily lead to incredibly high consent rates across. There's that wide range that Ned referred to. And I think that there's really several different reasons to it. And Andy Powers-Smith, who's FBA's communications director, actually addressed this shortly after the disclosure came out in July. And he talked about, there are differences in culture. That's a key driver for seeing different consent rates. Differences in privacy law. And he specifically noted Germany, and I certainly am not going to comment on that, and perhaps Elisabeth might, as her specialty and expertise. But, the different privacy laws have an impact on what we see in terms of consent rates. Different socioeconomic conditions in different countries. So sort of inherently, and there will be variation for those factors and several others. I think that the consent rates also were impacted by how aggressive companies were in terms of seeking out consent, in terms of some of those proactive efforts I mentioned before, in terms of educating their HCPs and explaining to them the importance of consenting to this. I think it was also affected by government support. Some governments would come out and support this, and seeing that, you would tend to get more buy-in from all the stakeholders in those particular countries. In Italy, both before and after the disclosures were publicly released, the Italian health minister expressed support for this initiative. So kind of getting that kind of buy-in from key stakeholders was important. And I also think that under the EFPIA code, there's no specific review and dispute period. So I think that some companies perhaps took this as an opportunity to reach out to their HCPs, even though they may have done everything that they should have done to get consent on the front end and be comfortable from a legal basis. Before actually releasing the information, many companies had a program to reach out to the HCPs and say, "Dear Dr. Smith, we know you consented. We plan to report 100,000 euros. Are you okay with this?" And give them another opportunity to confirm that the HCP was comfortable with this information being publicly released. And I think in doing that, perhaps you saw some HCPs move away when they realized that this kind of information would actually be out there from consenting to it. So I think that was a part. And in terms of the consent rate itself, and again, I presented on this topic specifically. Ned has. I've had some nice conversations with Ned about this. I don't know that the consent rate is always the best barometer of true transparency. And I say that for a couple reasons, and in the interest of time, I won't go into them in any detail, but I think that the consent rate can be a bit misleading because the way the EFPIA disclosure form is as implemented in the local countries, you don't know if the number who are being reported in the aggregate are all different individuals or perhaps overlapping, especially in different categories. So the way that's set up, it's difficult to determine a quote-unquote true consent rate. And it's also possible that an HCP could say, yes, I consent to pharma company X, but I'm not going to consent to pharma company Y. So if he or she did consulting work for both companies and consented to the 10,000 euro transfer value from the one company, but did not consent to the 1 million euro transfer value to the other company, that could be a bit misleading in terms of how transparent the system is. And someone might look and see that the doctor, my doctor received 10,000 euro, when in reality they received over 1 million. That just wasn't individually disclosed and was reported in the aggregate. So the consent rate, is a quick way to kind of get a sense of how effective the system may have been, but I think that it's not necessarily the most accurate or truest barometer. And I think that we've already seen in countries where there was a low consent rate, a different approach being taken. In Spain, the industry group there worked with the National Data Protection Authority to get a favorable opinion that companies would no longer have to obtain consent under the public interest analysis that the National Data Protection Agency went through. And as a result, beginning in 2017, pharma industry members in Spain only have to advise HCPs that the information will be reported at the individual level based on the legal support provided by the Spanish Data Protection Authority. We're seeing a similar effort in Greece, and perhaps other industry groups will pursue that, especially this year if perhaps their consent rates don't go up as high as they would like. And similarly, we've seen Belgium at the end of December in 2016 adopt the Sunshine Act that effectively codifies the EFPIA system that would obviate the need for consent because it's now legislation. So these consent rates are important, and it's important for industry to work to try to get those rates up so that they can prevent more laws from coming into place. And we'll see if there's also a move to see more countries try to do what Spain did and get a legal basis to perhaps move away from consent and get more individual level reporting, which is, I think, exactly what we're trying to get here, and have some true transparency into the industry HCP relationships.
Thank you, Brian. Appreciate that comprehensive review on consent rates and your guidance on factors that are in play that might influence them. Elisabeth, would love to hear your perspective on it.
Yeah, I think as Brian already explained, there's a large variety of reasons how and why this range might be that different. I'm looking at Germany and see that the consent rate for Germany is very low or quite low, and Austria also. Just to put in one more aspect, that we have here in Germany quite strict privacy laws, and people are aware of that. So they know that they do not have to disclose everything, and they really like it that they do not have to disclose everything. So maybe it's just also, as Brian already said, a difference in culture and a difference of how people want to share their personal information or do not want to share, like a very personal decision of the healthcare professional.
Super, thank you. So just to quickly summarize, what we heard is that the variance in rates are affected and influenced by a host of factors. Some of those are cultural differences, local laws, socioeconomic conditions, and also manufacturers' approach, including educating HCPs in collecting consent. And then the panelists also pointed out that the consent rates are beginning to influence legislature, and they mentioned the impact in Spain and Belgium from a legislative standpoint. So thank you so much for that comprehensive view on it. My next question is on the same aspect of transparency, but its impact on associations and member organizations. So I'm going to read EFPIA's position on their transparency directive. They believe that interactions between the pharmaceutical industry and healthcare professionals have a profound and positive influence on the quality of patient treatment and the value of future research. At the same time, the integrity of the decision of a healthcare professional to prescribe a medicine is one of the pillars of the healthcare system. EFPIA has shared this position. So in that context, if you would briefly share your experience and observations with respect to industry associations. By that I mean Pharma Industria in Italy or Spain, ABVI in UK and such. So what type of reaction did you see from the industry associations, and also your opinion if you feel EFPIA succeeded in meeting its transparency goal, which both of you, Brian and Elisabeth, shared that part of that goal was to voluntarily share information around spend to avoid complex legislature that makes it very expensive for many manufacturers to operate in various constituencies and affiliates. So maybe I can ask Elisabeth to go first this time.
Sure. So when I look at the goal that EFPIA puts itself, or the reason behind it, it is that they want you to strengthen the integrity of a decision of a healthcare professional to describe a medicine, which is surely a great goal, and which is a must be. And if this whole discussion about EFPIA and disclosure and should we disclose or should we not disclose, if it helps to raise the awareness and if it helps to strengthen the integrity of the decision of healthcare professionals, I think this is great. And then we are again one step ahead in having an ethical and proper functioning healthcare system. So and I think this is regardless of the rates we just saw before, how many physicians really consented to disclose. I think the whole discussion around it and the enhanced awareness and the re-evaluation how to cooperate with the healthcare professionals to have an integral decision of prescribing of medicine is good, and I think then EFPIA can say that they achieved a goal or part of their goal or a milestone.
Super. Brian, please.
Yeah, I would agree with much of what Elisabeth said. You know, it's a very aspirational system that EFPIA has come up with, and the mere existence of this disclosure code, I think in and of itself is an accomplishment that's unique to this industry. And there's a point that EFPIA has made. We're not seeing other industries, and I'm speaking outside the life sciences space, voluntarily disclose this kind of information in the absence of a legal basis to do so. So I think that the fact that the industry is doing this is firstly an accomplishment. In terms of, you know, when you go back to the consent rates and did they hit their goal, I think that folks just would love to see a higher consent rate. But I think that what EFPIA pointed out is for this first year, it was very successful. You're starting at a standing stop, and all of a sudden you're putting all this into place. And whether you had a consent rate in a particular country of 72% or 33%, that's more than it was the prior year when there was none of this type of disclosure. So to come from nothing to jump up to whatever the particular consent rate was is also a significant accomplishment. And I think that this year, EFPIA is working hard, as well as all its national members, to improve, to get those consent rates to go up. You know, we see in many of the countries, you know, Germany, Holger Diener, who's leading that transparency initiative, he's working conferences and being on panels and demonstrating and explaining the importance of that. Particular websites, the German industry group has a website devoted to transparency. The Polish group has that. Many others too. I'm just using these as examples. So I think that the industry groups themselves are really working hard to ensure that their members, in terms of the member company side, are out there getting consent as best they can and helping to, you know, give some best practices and things like that. And also, again, working with the HCPs. And that's the key thing that we shouldn't lose in looking at all this. That consent rate, it's not the consent rate of the pharmaceuticals, it's the consent rate of the doctors. The doctors are the ones who are entering into the relationship and are the ones who are choosing to either grant or block individual level information. So it's industry that's being as transparent as possible by going through this effort. And hopefully there'll be more buy-in from HCPs, and we'll see those consent rates rise in more and more places. You know, I was just reading an interview with someone in the IPHA, which is the Irish industry group, and their consent rate was in the mid-50s. And he said, you know, we think that this was a good start. Our goal is to get to 100% consent. We didn't think that we would be there in the beginning, but we're working to get to that. So hopefully we'll see in Ireland and all these other places to see that consent rate rise. Because unfortunately, if we don't, we might see, as Ned noted, more laws, which will be more expensive and more difficult to deal with, and create more burdens and problems for industry.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So I'll quickly summarize. What I heard from the panelists is in their opinion, EFPIA has been successful in its first year. Indeed, we would all love to see higher consent rates, but it was pretty successful for its first year. And both the panelists feel that the goal EFPIA has is aspirational and well-meaning, and more importantly, industry groups like Pharma Industria, ABPI, IPHA, and others are working hard to support it, and there is an expectation that industry has done its share, and hopefully physicians and physician associations will get behind it, which would help with the consent rates. So thank you so much for sharing that overall view. The last part in the aspect of stakeholders, of course, are patients, patient organizations, public at large, and legislature. So what I would like to share is, what I would like to ask, in fact, is Brian, yours and Elisabeth's general opinion of how the public, as well as media and other stakeholders responded, reacted to the transparency directive.
Sure. Would you like me to go first, or Elisabeth?
Certainly, Brian. Please go ahead.
Oh, okay. Much as the consent rate varied, I think that the reaction varied too among these various stakeholder groups, and I think a lot of that was driven, as with many issues, by the reaction from the media and what we saw in the press. I know that EFPIA put out last summer a chart that showed the tone of the articles covering the EFPIA disclosure, the first round of it, and according to their analysis, 57% was neutral, 25% was positive, 19% was negative. So that was their kind of analysis of the headlines, but you know, sometimes those negative headlines can be a little bit catchy and tend to perhaps garner the interest or attention of folks more than the positive or neutral ones. There was a series of articles in the UK that focused on, although the UK had a consent rate of 70%, various press and the BMJ drilled down into that, and they really were critical of the fact that the 30% who did not consent actually received 52% of the overall payment. So again, this is where we get into how illustrative truly is the consent rate. So that was one aspect where it would be easy to say, well, that's not very transparent if the majority of the spend is not being disclosed individually, even though the consent rate is 70%. So kind of drilling down into those numbers can lead to some more negative reaction. Several countries and the press in Switzerland and Austria, Germany have kind of gone through all the data and set up databases, Netherlands too, where they've tried to consolidate all this information, and you can go and try to search for your doctor, and oftentimes there'll be a less than flattering article or series of articles accompanying that in terms of why did Dr. X receive so much money from industry, and then they would interview the doctor, and he or she would explain and defend the relationship and talk about how they were working on drugs and doing different things to try to help develop new drugs and improve patient health care. So you have that kind of balance. So I think that, you know, we saw different reactions from the press. We saw different reactions from legislatures. I mentioned Italy, the Italian government there being supportive of it. You had, you know, other government officials in some countries come out and say they support it. We haven't seen a wholesale response among legislatures to say, well, that wasn't good enough, let's pass some laws immediately. I mentioned Belgium doing that, but it's more a codification of the EFPIA system. So, you know, there wasn't a widespread dissatisfaction based on any responsive legislative activity to this first round of disclosures, and hopefully that'll stay the course. I think that you also see some responses from other types of stakeholders, like Transparency International, Austria's chapter, commented that it was a good first step, but ultimately there may be the need for legislation because the system wasn't as transparent as they would like it to be. So you're seeing those kind of comments from some stakeholders. You know, the patient organizations, they're not part of the EFPIA disclosure code. They have their own patient organization code whereby companies do their reporting. So we haven't seen much in terms of that, although there were some recent articles in the academic press just last week, I think, in the J Journal of Medicine, Internal Medicine rather, calling for patient organizations to be part of, for example, the Sunshine Law in the U.S. and perhaps other places. So we haven't really seen much reaction there. And in terms of the public at large, it's hard to get a true reaction or response to that. Here in the U.S., there's been several years of data. There's been negative news articles, but most folks you bump into who aren't involved in this space probably don't know very much about open payments or particularly care. And I think that what Elisabeth noted before is a member of the public theoretically could go and search for his or her doctor, but it can be difficult in some of the countries where there's a central database. It would be easier to look up your particular HCP, and in those countries where the press has gone and created some type of database, you can do that. But in countries where there's not a central platform and where press has not gone through that, theoretically, a patient would have to go and figure out, okay, which pharmaceutical companies are members of the particular industry group, and then they would have to go to the websites, because in the absence of a central platform, companies are to post their disclosure reports on their websites, and then have to go onto the websites of the different member companies to see if their doctor is listed there. And of course, even if the doctor is not listed, that doesn't mean that he or she didn't have a relationship with industry, because they might have been doing R&D work or they might have not consented. So I'm not sure how many folks actually went through that process. So I'm not sure how much it's sort of gone down to the patient level in terms of reaction. I'm not aware of, in working with the companies we work with, HCPs getting negative blowback from patient interaction. So that's kind of, I think I kind of hit on most of those stakeholders. So, it was the first year, and we'll see if that's changed in this coming year.
Excellent. Thank you, Brian. Elisabeth, your take on it.
Thanks. Yeah, Brian, you already covered all those aspects we saw here from here too. I just want to add that, yes, we also noted here the database that the press set up. You have it also on your picture, Nat, this Spiegel Online article that is from Germany. And Spiegel Online is a very popular online magazine here in Germany. Like, almost everybody reads this on a daily basis. So I think a lot of people got aware of that database. And the whole article was a bit, it did not point out that disclosure is bad, but it always, when it comes to collaborations of healthcare professionals with pharma companies, it always has a taste of of a bad reputation. So the whole article was a little bit, like collaborations are suspicious in any ways. And here you can look up what your physician around the corner does. They even included a map, so that you just could scroll in the map and then look what your physician around the corner, how much he got paid, and how much your dentist got paid, and so the whole reporting in the press was a little bit going at the way that collaboration has some kind of a bad taste.
And I think, just to comment on that too, that's a good point in terms of the press coverage being, I'll just say, slanted, and making what's a totally appropriate normal relationship put that kind of negative slant on it. And that's also very easy for press or someone else to say in Germany, look, industry reported 575 million euro, and there's only a 33% consent rate. Or in the UK, it was 70% on 398 million, but only 30% of that was really but only 52% was truly disclosed. So it's easy when you're looking at that big amount of spend that's being reported, and you compare that to what might look like a low consent rate. It's quite easy to draw a negative perception and to draw that conclusion. So that's part of the battle that EFPIA and the industry groups and industry faces to put those numbers, both the spend, the consent, and the transparency initiative, in the appropriate context to explain that this is how drugs are researched and discovered and approved and ultimately get to market, and it's a whole long process. And what the purpose of that is, yes, money will be spent. Of course, we're going to work with HCPs and, trying to get the appropriate context around that to ensure that the message doesn't get stepped on and muddled and just bump up an artificial consent rate against a large amount of spend to make it seem like there's something nefarious at play when it's quite the opposite.
Yes,
Great.
and those databases, sorry, just one more comment. Those databases do not show the reason for the spend. They just show that something was spent, but they do not give the companies the opportunity to explain themselves or something. So I think communication with the public is important in that place, like in the press communication of the pharmaceutical companies, just to explain to the public that they have to develop drugs and then that it works like it works, and that not every spent money has every spent money is an improper influence.
Excellent, thank you. I'll skip the summary for the interest of addressing a couple of questions that have come in, and we have around 5 minutes. So this is a two-part question that has come in, and it's sort of representative of a couple other questions, so I'll read it. The question is regarding collecting consent to disclose from EU HCPs. Does it have to be in the form of a digital and/or vet signature? So that's the first part of the question. Elisabeth, I'm going to direct it to you because this sort of has a legal tone to it.
Yes, so consent given, in general, it says it must be in writing, but where it is appropriate, it can also be in electronic ways. So it's important is that when giving consent, that the person that is giving consent is fully informed about all the implications. So they must know which data are collected, for which purpose they are collected, and how and why and for which purpose they are published. So the important thing is that the person giving the consent is fully informed, and then it can be either in writing or in electronic ways that he gives the consent.
Super, thank you. And so there's a second part to that question, and the question is that does this requirement vary from country to country? So meaning the requirement for digital or vet signature, does it vary from country to country within EU?
I'm not entirely sure if the written is, well, I have to give you a background on that. At the moment, we have a data protection directive in Europe, which is applicable all through Europe, but every member state has its own privacy law, its national privacy law. So when giving consent, the consent must comply with this national privacy law, which is based on the general EU data protection directive. So the member states may have slightly different regulations at the moment from member state to member state, but the general idea is based down in this directive and the same across the whole member state. I do not know at the moment if the requirement for writing is laid down in the directive, but I think yes. In the future, we will have the medical devices regulation, the general data protection regulation. It applies from May 2018, and then we will have only this one regulation that applies in all the member states, and then all the requirements will be the same for all the member states. So this will change in the future.
Okay.
And Nate, if I could just comment quickly on
certainly, Brian, please.
Operational piece of that. Elisabeth noted that there are some variations in the data protection laws across Europe. They're largely similar, and I think that goes back to what I was saying before in terms of managing the process. How involved do you want your local affiliates to be? Are you going to delegate entirely to them the consent process? Are you going to manage it from headquarters? Are you going to do it kind of regionally? And it's important to get that local buy-in on some level, or someone at headquarters who knows all about the local requirements to ensure that you're always compliant with the governing data protection law. And although we've been focusing a lot on HCPs and consent today because of the legal requirements, you have the HCOs that are part of the disclosure code too, and generally you don't have to get their consent, but there are a couple countries like Austria where the data protection laws extend not only to natural persons but also to legal persons. So that's, again, an important consideration when you're developing policies and procedures to ensure that you have the appropriate input and cooperation from your local folks to ensure that you're able to comply with all those unique variations in the data protection laws that Elisabeth referred to.
Super. Brian and Elisabeth, thank you so much for a very rich and comprehensive discussion on EFPIA Transparency Directive and the consent. I really appreciate you taking your time in detailing and describing the questions I shared. Folks, you heard both the business side of the practice as well as the related legal side of the directive. Hopefully, this discussion covered the gamut from the manufacturers to physicians to patients to associations as well as legislature. Again, I want to thank both Elisabeth and Brian who brought their immense experience and their organization's immense knowledge and give them a shout out. Elisabeth from King Spalding, and again, King Spalding has practice that spans supporting several hundred manufacturers, and Brian from Porzio Life Sciences, who have been supporting pharmaceutical manufacturers across the globe, US, EU, and the like. So both Brian and Elisabeth, again, thank you so much. And attendees, thank you so much for spending your 1 hour with us. Take care. Bye.